Skeptics have said the Bible is full of contradictions and errors. In this episode, I want to look at one. The question is, did Saul know David before David killed Goliath? The answer might surprise you. One of the best-known stories from the Old Testament is David and Goliath. It's so well known that David and Goliath has become shorthand for any time a smaller, weaker hero goes up against a much larger, stronger opponent. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm writing a series of novels called Age of the Kingdom, set against the backdrop of the reigns of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon in the Bible. David kills Goliath right at the end of Quest for a King, the first book of the series. But there's a problem in the story that prompts the question, did King Saul know David before he killed Goliath? If you just read the story of David and Goliath, there's no problem. But if you read the chapter before, the problem becomes apparent. 1 Samuel 17 is the chapter that contains the story of David and Goliath. Starting in verse 55, it says, "When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, 'Whose son is this youth, Abner?' And Abner said, 'As your soul lives, O king, I do not know.' The king said, 'Inquire whose son the young man is.' So when David returned from slaying the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. Saul said to him, 'Whose son are you, young man?' And David answered, 'I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite.'" So it sounds like from these verses that King Saul did not know David before he killed Goliath. But let's take a look at 1 Samuel 16, the previous chapter. Early verses tell us Saul was being afflicted by an evil spirit and music would calm him. So a search was made to find someone who was skillful at playing the lyre. Starting in verse 17, Saul said to his servants, "Find me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me." Then one of the servants answered and said, "I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is experienced in playing music, a mighty man of valor, a man of battle, and skillful in words, even a man of fine appearance, and the Lord is with him." Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me David your son, who is with the sheep." Jesse took a donkey laden with bread, a bottle of wine, and a young goat, and he sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and stood before him, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight." It happened that when an evil spirit from God came on Saul, David would take his lyre in his hand and play. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. So in chapter 16, Saul likes David very much, and David often sits before him playing music. Saul even makes him his armor-bearer, it says. Then in the very next chapter, King Saul and Abner seem to have no idea whatever who David is. As I said at the beginning, skeptics like to seize on such things as this to say there are contradictions and errors in the Bible, so they conclude it cannot be trusted as a historical document. But if the Bible brings you spiritual comfort and guidance, and you believe it is the inspired Word of God, how do you deal with something like this? I mean, this is a contradiction, isn't it? If you are a believer, you shouldn't ignore apparent contradictions in the Bible, but try to understand them so you don't lose your faith as the skeptics have. So how to explain this apparent contradiction? In Quest for a King, I skirt the issue by showing David in the court of King Saul to soothe him with music and then showing him again killing Goliath, but I don't show Saul asking Abner whose son David is at the occasion of the killing of Goliath. A novel is not the right place to deal with that problem, but I do think it's important to deal with it. Hopefully what follows will be helpful. First, it's important to realize that we don't know the author for biblical books like 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. At least no author is identified. There are Jewish traditions that say Samuel wrote 1st Samuel, with the prophets Nathan and Gad finishing it, because Samuel dies during 1st Samuel, so he could not have written all of it. And he could not have written 2nd Samuel at all. Others believe these books were part of official records that began to be kept during the reigns of David and Solomon, in which case there were likely royal secretaries whose job it was to document everything that happened. In fact, some believe these secretaries were the first ones to assemble the early writings that became the Old Testament. Of course, liberal scholars believe these books were written much later by people with no first-hand knowledge of the events. Whoever wrote down the stories, they probably were written down later after the stories had been told orally for a while. My thought is that chapter 16 and 17 must have been written by different people, and each author didn't know what the other had written. There are good reasons for thinking this. Both chapters begin by introducing David's father and his brothers as if they were being introduced for the first time. That makes it almost certain that the two chapters were written by different people who thought they needed to start at the very beginning. In chapter 16, King Saul meets David for the first time and learns who he is. In chapter 17, King Saul meets him again, but doesn't seem to know him. Some would say King Saul's question to Abner after David killed Goliath was an embellishment to the story by someone who wasn't there and didn't hear the actual conversation. In fact, it is most likely that whoever wrote down the story in chapter 17 was not there and did not actually hear the conversation. Another possibility is that Saul, who was harassed by the evil spirit manifested as severe depression or bipolar disorder, may not have remembered David or may not have recognized an older young man as the same person who ministered to him as a child. I'm sure you've had the experience of meeting someone and then later seeing them in a different context, and you just couldn't place them. But technically, Saul does not ask David's name in chapter 17 after the killing of Goliath. He asks who David's father is. This is because the reward for killing the giant included the king's daughter's hand in marriage, and in those days, marriage was a contract between the two fathers. Another reward was the family being free from taxation. That also involved David's father as much as him. So even if King Saul remembered David playing for him, he may not have remembered who his father was. King Saul can't be expected to remember every elderly shepherd in the kingdom, after all. What about the statement in chapter 16 that Saul made David his armor-bearer? We know that later on, after David killed Goliath, Saul gave David 1,000 soldiers to command, and he did indeed serve as Saul's personal guard for a time, until Saul decided David was a threat to his throne and tried to kill him. So in chapter 16, when it says David became Saul's armor-bearer, it is likely a reference to what happened later. Perhaps chapter 16 is a statement encompassing David's longer life and experience, both before and after the incident with Goliath. Still another explanation that has been put forward is that chapter 16 really should appear after 17. Which could have been done if the two chapters were separate documents by different authors. We know that David did indeed play the lyre for Saul after he killed Goliath, so that would make sense. The fact that chapter 16 says Saul made David his armor bearer, but chapter 17 has David come to the battlefield as a civilian, would seem to support the idea that the chapters could be in the wrong order. As believers, it's important to recognize that the writers of the Bible wrote when God inspired them to write, but they didn't always have all the information about everything they wrote about. Inspiration does not confer omniscience, which is a $100 word way to say just because the Holy Spirit inspires a writer to write doesn't mean the writer knows everything about everything. In fact, sometimes the Bible writers didn't even understand what they were writing. The significance of the messages might only become clear much later as events unfolded. This is especially true of prophecy. Do we think that Ezekiel or John the Revelator understood all the symbolism of what they saw in vision? I really doubt it. Yet they obediently wrote down what God gave them. And another point to remember is that the Bible contains many different kinds of literature. The records of the events surrounding Israel's kings are very different in form and purpose from the apocalyptic prophecy writings of Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and John. And those are very different from the poetry in books like Psalms and Song of Solomon, not to mention the letters of Paul in the New Testament. All of these types of literature have different purposes and were composed in different ways, often by very different people in very different cultures and times. So in a nutshell, as we read the Bible, we need to understand that God used human beings to write who were fallible and may not have understood everything they wrote, to the point that things written by different people at different times may appear contradictory. But those problems are very small compared to the overarching message of love and forgiveness we find in the Bible as a whole. When you think about it, the Bible is not a book, but a library with many documents written over a period of nearly 2,000 years in a variety of languages and cultures. It's amazing and evidence of its inspiration that its message is as coherent as it is. So did Saul know David before he killed Goliath? I think he did. In Quest for a King, I have David come to the court of Saul to play for him, but Saul is soon embroiled in the war with the Philistines. That's when David's father sends him to take food to his 3 oldest brothers who are in the field with Saul's army. David volunteers to fight the giant, and a hero is born. Maybe Saul didn't remember him. Maybe he just needed to know David's father's name and tribe so he could give him the rewards. We may not know why this apparent contradiction is in the Bible, but we can take comfort from these stories that God will give us victory over the giant problems in our own lives. If you enjoy this content, I hope you'll like the video and subscribe to my channel. And if you're just getting started reading the Bible, there are links in the description below to books that may help you. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.